In 1942, Allied convoys crossing the Atlantic faced catastrophic losses. Ships were going down in staggering numbers, with entire months seeing over 100 sunk. By 1943, losses had dropped sharply, yet the U-boats themselves had not grown weaker. Something else had changed. Buried in declassified records is the story of a tactical school in Liverpool, the Western Approaches Tactical Unit, where young officers and Wrens spent nights pushing wooden markers across large gaming boards. They weren't fighting with torpedoes, but with ideas. And those ideas, later coded as Operation Raspberry, would quietly alter the course of the Atlantic War. Yet before understanding how, we need to see the dire situation that made such an unorthodox school necessary. The Convoy crisis. Grey hulls pressed forward through Atlantic swells, freighters and tankers clinging together in vulnerable lines. Their decks creaked under salt spray while smoke from funnels hung low across the sea. Beneath that murk, steel hunters prowled. U-boats tracked the convoys with patience, striking most often beneath the cover of night when visibility fell and fear thickened. The men on watch knew the ocean around them was no longer just water. It was a battlefield where death could close in from any direction. By 1942, the crisis reached its sharpest point. Losses on the North Atlantic route threatened Britain's survival in measurable terms. In May alone, 111 Allied ships were sunk, followed by 115 the next month. Tankers carrying oil burned for days on the horizon, while grain freighters destined to feed British cities never arrived. Ammunition and machinery disappeared into the depths, leaving soldiers abroad short of vital supplies. These were not isolated events, but a pattern so relentless that Churchill would later confess the U-boat campaign was the only battle that ever truly frightened him. For Britain, which imported much of its food and raw materials, every torpedo meant literal hunger at home and weakening strength at the front. Convoys represented the only workable solution, yet they were also a gamble. To scatter the merchant fleet invited certain destruction. Only through the convoys could escorts provide even partial shelter. Each time a convoy sailed, it was both an act of necessity and one of resignation. Everyone knew some ships would not survive. Still, the Admiralty clung to flawed assumptions about how the enemy fought. Prevailing doctrine insisted U-boats attacked from outside the columns, circling convoys and launching torpedoes inward. Defensive measures such as Commodore Walker's Buttercup maneuver, designed to drive off threats moving in from the perimeter, offered only occasional success. The gap between assumed theory and the evidence at sea grew larger with every crossing. Many escorts relied on sonar equipment too crude to meet the task. Operators strained to detect faint sounds in the expanse ahead of the conv, never considering that U-boats might already be threading their way inside the columns themselves. In reality, the most dangerous salvos often came from within the very formation thought to shield the freighters. When the Western Approaches Tactical Unit later presented this possibility, it directly contradicted the Admiralty's long-held assumptions and revealed why so many ships were struck despite numerical escort protection. This mismatch between the established view and the actual movements of German submarines ensured the convoys remained painfully vulnerable. The scale of the risk touched ordinary life ashore. By the winter of 1942, Britain's imports had dropped to nearly half their pre-war level. Families experienced shrinking rations. Flour was dear, sugar scarce, meat allotments tighter each month. Shops carried fewer goods not because the nation lacked will, but because the ocean war was bleeding the supply lines dry. The air of London or Glasgow could feel calm, yet every dinner plate carried evidence of the convoys, struggle thousands of miles away. Behind closed doors, administrators calculated how many weeks of food reserves remained, sometimes reducing the nation's margin of survival to little more than a month. At sea, officers saw their confidence eroding. Traditional techniques, escorts spread further out, rigid patrol assignments, failed to reduce losses, sometimes costing the lives of destroyer crews without saving the convoy they protected. Meanwhile, German production lines at Bremen and Kiel rolled out new submarines faster than Britain could invent an answer. and those U-boats refined their tactics through coordinated wolfpack assaults. The convoy system was stretched between necessity and futility. Britain could not abandon it, yet could not sustain the losses it was suffering. Still, the greatest obstacle was not only industrial, but intellectual. The German Navy showed willingness to adapt quickly, shifting attack methods as soon as defenders adjusted, while British strategies lagged behind. The Royal Navy's organizational culture discouraged junior officers from challenging official doctrine. Those who suspected something was deeply wrong with the assumptions guiding their defense had little voice. As one operations officer put it, the most dangerous weapons in the Atlantic were often not U-boats themselves, but entrenched beliefs about how those U-boats fought. Resistance to new thinking ensured that failures repeated voyage after voyage. Early in 1943, however, the balance began to shift. Convoy survival rates improved in ways officers could not easily explain. Charts in operations rooms that had once bled red ink with loss reports now showed signs of relief. More ships were making landfall intact, and for the first time in years, there was cautious optimism that the Atlantic lifeline might hold. Some credited heavier escorts, others the weather, and still others luck. None of these explanations satisfied those who looked closely, because by then the German Navy was sending even more submarines into the fight, and their wolfpacks remained as disciplined and aggressive as ever. Something else had changed, something intangible, yet decisive. This change could not be traced to a new destroyer class or to a bunker full of cutting-edge weapons. It was born instead from a re-evaluation of assumptions. A few officers began to ask if Britain had been fighting the wrong kind of battle entirely, and whether success required reconsidering where, when, and how U-boats staged their attacks. Those questions would not be answered by patrols at sea, but in a quiet place far from the convoy routes, where unexpected minds were running experiments the Admiralty scarcely acknowledged. Out of sight of the ocean battles, the first glimmers of a different approach were taking shape. Within a secure compound in Liverpool, a small group of officers and Wrens worked through the night, not with ships and guns, but with boards and markers. Their simulations began to reveal what the convoys themselves could not see, that the accepted picture of U-boat tactics was dangerously incomplete. And once that picture was corrected, the entire defense of the Atlantic could be redrawn. The hidden room in Liverpool. At Derby House in Liverpool, behind reinforced walls and guarded gates, there was a room that most visitors overlooked. It lacked the trappings of command, no polished oak, no ceremonial banners. Instead, the space was plain. Linoleum tiles scored with chalk grids, long tables cluttered with papers, and wooden blocks cut to the shape of ships. This was the Western Approaches Tactical Unit, or WATU, established in early 1942 with one purpose: to uncover why convoys were being cut apart. What looked to outsiders like a clerical office was in fact a workshop of tactical experiments whose influence would reach across the Atlantic. Few passing by suspected that within this ordinary room, late-night simulations would begin changing the course of the naval war. Inside, the staff looked nothing like the Royal Navy's elite surface fleet. At its core were young Wrens, members of the Women's Royal Naval Service, many scarcely past school age, supported by convalescent officers pulled from sea duty, civilians with mathematical training, and a handful of academics. To career officers, trained in centuries of tradition, this assembly of outsiders hardly seemed equipped to solve what the Navy itself could not. Yet over time, 66 Wrens would serve at WATU, and more than 5,000 officers from across the fleet would cycle through for training in the tactics developed within these walls. Among them were women whose names deserve remembering: Jean Laidlaw, the chartered accountant turned analyst, and Janet Oakle, who would one day defeat the commander-in-chief in a war game staged on this very floor. The nightly scene was unusual, and to some, faintly absurd. A half-dozen Wrens crouched or knelt over the mat-lined floor, sliding wooden counters across squares with steady hands. Escorts, merchants, U-boats, they all became tokens pushed by call and counter-call. Chalk marks stretched across the grid, depicting wake lines, firing arcs, and imagined sonar beams. Orders were delivered in clipped 2-minute intervals, the same rhythm officers at sea lived by. Though the pieces moved quietly, the stakes loomed large in everyone's mind. A clumsy decision here reflected a clumsy decision at sea. A risky maneuver that saved the board convoy might save the next convoy in fact. Exhaustion often blurred into dawn as sequences were repeated again and again until the chalk-misted floor told a fuller story than official reports ever had. What gave WATU its strength was not pedigree but freedom. Most Wrens had no deep-sea background, and the older officers in the room were not bound by illusions of returning to proud commands. Their distance from frontline tradition meant they could ask questions without fear of ridicule. If an idea sounded fanciful, they tested it anyway. If a doctrine seemed wrong, they erased and tried another. Errors here cost nothing but chalk dust. Each reset of the markers created space for imagination, something long absent from tactical training in the fleet. This willingness to think as differently as their composition allowed became the unit's most valuable asset. In charge of the room stood Captain Gilbert Roberts. Once a destroyer commander, tuberculosis had ended his sea career in 1938, a blow that left him land-bound in midlife. Yet his prior work at the Portsmouth Tactical School had armed him with the habits of experimentation and wargaming, a field dismissed by many senior officers as little more than make-believe. Roberts approached the Liverpool mats like an austere schoolmaster, part patient teacher, part investigator. He instructed participants not to see rows of ships, but to imagine themselves as the U-boat commander seeking advantage. If convoys were being cracked apart in the open ocean, then somewhere in the official defensive playbook was a blind spot. His task was to make officers recognize that blind spot before it consumed them at sea. Convincing the higher command was another matter. Reports from WATU drew skepticism. To admirals who had earned their standing in salt water and steel, the idea that wooden blocks could reveal what years of patrols had not was laughable. Some dismissed Roberts's findings outright, filing them away without comment. The unit's warnings, especially the claim that U-boats were striking from inside convoys, contradicted entrenched beliefs. Official doctrine assumed submarines circled beyond convoy limits before unleashing their spreads of torpedoes inward, and any deviation from that view sounded like speculation. Roberts and his team carried the burden of knowing that losses at sea mirrored the failures their maps kept repeating, while their conclusions evaporated unheeded above them. Yet even in this climate of doubt, smaller victories began to shape perceptions. One episode became legendary within the unit. Admiral Sir Max Horton, Commander-in-Chief of Western Approaches, paid a visit and skeptically agreed to sit in on a wargame. On the mat, the task of stalking and striking the conv fell not to one of Roberts's senior officers, but to a young Wren, Janet Okel. With methodical calm, she executed a simulated U-boat maneuver that outplayed the Admiral's escort defense. Horton, the embodiment of Navy authority, had been undone by a 20-year-old woman moving blocks across a board. The effect on Roberts's team was electric. For once, their methods had not just produced results, but forced a senior officer to confront them directly. We will return to that encounter, but at the time it signaled that WATU's work could no longer be brushed aside as clerical play. Every replay of a wolfpack sequence drilled the same revelation deeper. Escorts sweeping around the convoy's outer rim detected too little and too late. Torpedoes were detonating in the center, at points unreachable if the U-boats had fired from outside. The math, the geometry of movement, showed again and again that attackers must already be among the freighters at the moment of impact. Diagrams crowded with arrows and chalk dust narrowed the possibilities until one unwelcome truth emerged. If the Navy was looking outward, then it was looking in the wrong place entirely. But what the markers suggested was something more disturbing than poor doctrine. If U-boats were already within convoys, how had they entered at all? Watch crews scanned the horizons, radar was patchy but not blind, and sonar pings swept arcs ahead of the formation. Yet still, the submarines came unseen. The unit could prove where the weapons were launched from, but not yet how the hunters arrived there. Solving that secondary mystery, the secret of entry, would soon consume just as many hours as the first. Rethinking the U-boat. To examine this puzzle, the Liverpool team had to confront long-held assumptions and measure them against the limits of the submarine itself. The Royal Navy had imagined entry routes based on underwater pursuit, but those ideas faltered once WATU began testing them against the numbers. The first scenario, a submerged approach from astern, initially seemed reasonable, the image of a U-boat crawling up beneath the trailing lines undetected. Yet on the gaming boards, the flaws became obvious. A Convoy averaged around 7 knots, while a submerged Type WRNS, limited to electric motors, managed little more than 8. That tiny difference meant an agonizingly slow overtake, giving sonar operators hours to detect it. In practice, the supposed advantage collapsed. The second scenario tested was a frontal penetration, the notion of a submarine lying in wait ahead, then slicing into the conv as it passed. This too unraveled quickly, with dozens of hulls spaced tight across the sea, each moving in formation, threading a U-boat submerged through the forward arc risked chaos. Collisions, sonar pings, and the constant presence of escorts meant survival was extremely unlikely. On the floorboards in Liverpool, the theory failed before the first markers had even crossed. As each of these options fell apart, the team's attention shifted. Perhaps the central mistake lay in assuming the U-boat behaved primarily as a submerged predator. In truth, a Type WRNS was faster and more agile on the surface. Its 17 knots under diesel power was more than double the pace of the Convoy. In darkness or with heavy seas, its silhouette shrank into the horizon line. At a glance, it could be mistaken for an errant fisherman or a straggling merchant. WATU's trials, informed by signals, reports, and survivor testimony, pointed to the same answer. The most plausible explanation was surface infiltration at night. This reframing altered everything. On the boards, blocks representing U-boats shadowed the convoys at distance, then darted forward in bursts to close the gap. At those speeds, catching the rear was straightforward, and once alongside, the infiltrators simply aligned themselves with the columns, blending into the formation until ready to fire. Seen from the bridge of a merchantman, that low, dark shape disappeared into clutter. The ship's own wake and smoke obscured lookout views. During night watches, the margin for detection was almost none. Inside the convoy, the danger multiplied. A commander in position could unleash a spread of torpedoes at near point-blank range, rupturing 2 or 3 ships in seconds. The tactic aimed not only to sink hulls, but to splinter order. Panicked captains veered off station, escorts raced to pursue phantom traces outside, and the submarine, concealed in the middle of it all, struck again. What seemed inexplicable in Survivor, reports suddenly matched the simulations. Convoys unraveling from the center, while escorts scoured the edges in vain. Yet an attack could not last. The question remained, how did the submarines get clear once the trap was sprung? Here too, the Wargames yielded the most plausible answer. After launching, the infiltrator dived. Electric motors replaced diesels, and the U-boat fell silent beneath the surface. At depths far below the keels, it simply waited. As the convoy steamed on, dozens of screws churned overhead, masking sonar signals with a blanket of noise. By the time escorts tightened their patterns, the attacker was already astern. The logic was cold and efficient. The conv itself provided cover for the submarine's escape. Condensed to its essentials, the tactic was simple: sprint on the surface under darkness, infiltrate from the rear, fire at close range from within, then submerge and let the formation pass above. Reports that had seemed contradictory now fit together. Survivors remembered torpedoes erupting in the middle of convoys without sight of an attacker. Escorts recalled chasing empty sonar echoes around the flanks. WATU's boards showed how both accounts could be accurate under a single pattern of infiltration and withdrawal. This recognition mattered because it directly contradicted the standing view at Admiralty. Official doctrine defined the U-boat as an underwater stalker, circling convoys from outside. But evidence gathered and reconstructed in Liverpool suggested something else. The submarine was above all a surface raider, choosing to dive only when it had already struck. That difference was more than technical correction. It meant every defensive tactic designed for encirclement was misaligned. Lookouts watched the wrong approaches. Escorts swept the wrong arcs. Hours of fuel and hundreds of lives were wasted because the enemy was imagined in the wrong place. For the WATU team, adopting this picture was not a final triumph, but only a beginning. If U-boats could slip in unseen and vanish just as easily, new ways of protecting convoys had to be devised. Knowing the method of attack alone could not keep freighters afloat. It only meant the old model was broken. The harder task was to replace it. All of this placed WATU in an awkward position. Their boards produced consistent evidence of the most plausible tactic, but the explanations on paper clashed with Admiralty's convictions. To change minds was a larger battle than plotting markers across grids. At stake was not just the question of how U-boats struck, but whether young Wrens and sidelined officers in a backroom could teach the Royal Navy to rethink its own war. And it was here that tension deepened. In Liverpool, Roberts and his Wrens had found a clearer picture of U-boat infiltration, but success on maps and chalkboards did not guarantee acceptance in Whitehall. Senior officers still clung to their assumptions with a stubborn grip, dismissing alternative thinking as unproven and risky. Convoys continued to bleed, while entrenched doctrines held firm. The next move would require more than just deduction. It would demand boldness in proposing an entirely different defensive scheme, and proof strong enough to confront resistance at the very top. The birth of Operation Raspberry. Resistance inside the Royal Navy was unmistakable. Senior officers clung to their long-held theories of convoy defense and gave little weight to alternatives, insisting that escorts should stay tight, sweep outward, and chase contacts at the edges. The centerpiece of this defensive thinking was Walker's Buttercup tactic, once hailed as innovative. But on WATU's boards, Buttercup collapsed. It assumed U-boats lingered outside convoys, when in fact the attackers were already deep inside. To the team in Liverpool, it was plain that doctrine rooted in the wrong assumptions could never succeed. Yet their corrections were too often dismissed as speculation by men convinced that only seasoned sea commanders could dictate how to fight the enemy. Inside the hidden room, frustration mounted. Reports arrived week after week showing freighters burning at sea, while the official countermeasures failed to show results. Each recreation confirmed that chasing ghosts outside the conv left U-boats free to strike at its heart. The Liverpool group knew that continuing to apply the same failing methods was squandering lives. The need for something new became urgent, and the burden of devising it fell squarely on their shoulders. Among those shoulders was Jean Laidlaw's. At only 21, and with training as a chartered accountant, she seemed an unlikely figure to reshape convoy tactics. Yet she had been the very first Wren recruited into the unit by Vera Laughton Matthews, who selected women for their analytical skill rather than secretarial talent. Laidlaw possessed a natural ability to think in sequences and patterns, and most important, she did not inherit tradition's blind spots. Where older officers relied on instinct, she transformed fragments of reports and calculations into repeatable tests. Night after night, she joined Roberts in running scenarios, watching as U-boats on the boards attacked, submerged, and then waited patiently until escorts had passed overhead before surfacing astern to begin again. The picture was consistent. The convoys needed a way to sweep clear the waters behind them just as the submarines chose to resurface. Laidlaw, working with Roberts, sketched a solution in geometric form. Rather than scattering escorts outward at random, position them to move as a group, fanning behind the conv in triangular sweeps. In this net-like pattern, overlapping sonar beams increased the chance of finding a submarine before it could rejoin the fight. To make the trap more effective, they added the firing of star shells, bright flares casting arcs of light across the sea for 10 or 12 minutes, forcing any U-boat to either stay submerged, drained of speed and oxygen, or to risk surfacing under illumination. First, the design seemed unorthodox, even unsafe. Escorts appeared to be peeling away from their charges at the very moment an attack might occur. But on the boards, the calculations spoke clearly. Time after time, U-boats resurfacing in the convoy's wake were thrown into the paths of those sweeping escorts. Where Buttercup failed, the new triangles consistently closed a trap. Where once submarines had slipped back into the night unhindered, now they were spotted, engaged, or at least held at depth. There was clear evidence of a viable counter. When it came time to name the maneuver, Laidlaw offered her own suggestion. She called it Raspberry, a pointed joke, a derisive sound at Hitler and his submarine arm. The levity hid a serious purpose. In Liverpool, to bestow that mocking title on a formal tactic was to declare independence from the rigid style of Admiralty thinking, to prove that the Wrens' unconventional perspective could reshape naval combat. The name stuck, perhaps because it carried the same audacity as the maneuver itself. Operation Raspberry was no longer just chalk marks on boards, but a tangible idea ready to be argued before the highest command. Still, ideas alone altered nothing. To matter, Raspberry needed Admiralty approval. That meant convincing men uninterested in theories produced by chalk and wooden markers. The prospect of presenting the plan to senior officers was tense. Many wondered whether captains would ever accept being taught new tactics by women younger than most of their sailors. Yet Roberts prepared carefully for the moment, aware that without endorsement, weeks of refinement would remain locked in Liverpool. When Admiral Percy Noble visited the unit, the atmosphere grew taut. Here was a commander who had doubted the value of wargaming, holding in his hands the ability to dismiss the work entirely. The Wrens laid out the convoy, shifted escort markers into triangular positions, and waited as the submarine tokens made their play. Then came the counter-move. Escorts swept behind in practiced arcs, star shells rising in imagined bursts. Again and again, the U-boats were trapped in the very zone they had once exploited with impunity. Noble watched quietly, then insisted on multiple reruns of the scenario. Each time, the pattern worked. At last, acknowledgement crossed his expression. What had looked eccentric hours before now stood as a solution too consistent to ignore. With that, the first barrier began to fall. Later, Admiral Max Horton, who had replaced Noble as Commander-in-Chief Western Approaches, would witness similar demonstrations and lend his backing as well. The combination carried decisive weight. After Roberts and his team showed Raspberry directly to these senior officers, the move was authorized for the fleet. Within days, the maneuver was written into signals, coded for dispatch, and distributed across escort groups. What had begun as a sequence of chalk lines had become an operational order. Convoy commanders now carried with them the option of setting the Raspberry in motion on the open sea. For the Wrens, the satisfaction was profound, though tempered by reality. A diagram could convince an admiral, but only a convoy under fire could prove the tactic in practice. For now, Raspberry was a plan on paper, accepted at last, but untested against real torpedoes and real chaos. The next step was unavoidable. Officers had to learn how to execute it under pressure, to drill until its movements were second nature. That responsibility fell upon the very unit that had invented it, as they now turned from invention to the equally daunting work of training those who would carry it into battle. Training a fleet in secret. The task of turning Raspberry from theory into practice began in Liverpool, where a steady stream of officers arrived each week to undergo training that was as secretive as it was demanding. To them, it appeared little more than another course in convoy defense, but inside the Western Approaches tactical unit, the aim ran deeper, to change the very way they thought about fighting U-boats. Convincing whether beaten commanders of that change was never straightforward. Many arrived certain their instincts were enough, only to be brought up short on the linoleum floor. The first time a senior officer attempted Raspberry, the demonstration sank quickly into silence. His escorts scattered too wide, the triangular sweep bent off course, and the small wooden submarine slid away untouched. Resetting the blocks, he tried again, and failed the same way. Men who had spent years braving gales and torpedoes found themselves humbled by chalk marks and counters. They grumbled that no real ship would be ordered to behave so loosely. The Wrens, overseeing the game, said little, only setting the board back to starting positions. The message was clear enough. Here, mistakes did not bring reprimands, but nor did past service shield anyone from failure. Such moments were common in the early sessions. Officers trained to hunt outside convoys could not easily imagine threats lurking within. Their instincts urged them to charge outward at every contact, leaving submarines hidden in the columns untouched. The purpose of the exercise, therefore, was to break habit. Captain Roberts reminded each class in the same words: "Make your mistakes here on the oilcloth, and you won't make them at sea." In Liverpool, failure was acceptable, even expected, because every miss on the board meant one fewer in the Atlantic. The mechanics of the training reinforced that lesson. Officers stood behind canvas screens, so they saw only what a real commander could from a bridge. Across the map, Wrens moved counters for escorts and merchants, while the U-boat's path was drawn in green chalk, invisible to the trainees. Only when a sonar operator marker made a correct sweep did a fragment of that hidden track appear. Torpedoes fired were marked in white, sudden lines cutting through the conv without warning. And always, the clock ticked in 2-minute turns, the same rhythm of decision-making demanded at sea. The routine was neither abstract nor leisurely. It forced command under pressure, as close to reality as boards and chalk could make it. Each day ran to the same relentless pace. Mornings began with lectures on sonar bearings, triangle geometry, and the principles behind the maneuver itself. Afternoons were spent in rehearsals on the floor, the Wrens correcting errors and replaying sequences until movements settled into muscle memory. Evenings brought longer exercises, sometimes dragging past midnight, when entire convoy battles were fought out in compressed time. Men left the room drained, only to return again at morning call. Raspberry could not be delivered by a written order. It had to be wired into instinct, so that under spray and gunfire, a commander would move his escorts without hesitation into their triangular sweeps. WATU ran week-long courses for officers. About 5,000 were trained from 1942 to 1945. Each week brought a new group of up to 50 through the door, and each departed with more than theory. They carried a common doctrine that would unify escort groups drawn from many different nations. Canadians, Americans, Norwegians, Free French, and others all stood on the same linoleum, absorbing the same rhythms of thought. Where once a multinational convoy risked confusion, now officers shared a vocabulary of signals, sweeps, and expectations, drilled until consistent. Such standardization was as important as the tactic itself, for in waters vast enough to scatter entire fleets, coherence mattered as much as firepower. Inevitably, pride bent under the weight of repetition. Some veterans, after early failures, admitted aloud that they had been steering at ghosts. Others found themselves thinking the way Roberts intended, not as escorts, but as submariners. Each turn began with the unspoken question: what would a U-boat captain do next? Where would he seek an angle? Where would he run once discovered? Gradually, escorts ceased reacting blindly and began to anticipate. Those who had once scoffed at games concluded by acknowledging they had been fighting the wrong kind of war. Such reversals were whispered around the unit, testimonials that thought itself had been refitted. The board results reflected that change. At first, the small submarine block slipped through almost every exercise, firing spreads and vanishing with ease. By the later days of each course, escorts coordinated properly, sweeping astern in patterns that overlapped, driving attackers down and pinning them to surfaces where depth charges could fall. The shift could be counted in game ratios. Failure gave way to repeated successes until the hunters appeared less like phantoms and more like opponents susceptible to reason. Survival ceased to be a matter of luck. It became something officers could influence with disciplined moves. Secrecy cloaked the process. To the public, Liverpool was a city of air raids and dockyards, not wargames. Little trace of the training appeared in newspapers or communiques. The precautions were deliberate. To announce a new convoy tactic risked alerting the very submariners they hoped to ambush. So the courses proceeded quietly, class after class filing in and out across 3 years. Few outside Derby House understood that on those chalked floors were rehearsed the habits that would decide whether shipments of wheat, oil, and ammunition ever reached their destination. This effort was recognized privately at high command. Admiral Max Horton later sent, thanks to those involved, praising WATU as vital to the eventual outcome. Admiral Noble wrote similarly, reflecting that if the Atlantic battle had been lost, the war itself would have been in jeopardy, and that WATU had helped prevent that fate. But for the officers who passed through the course, the more tangible evidence lay in their own change of mindset. They had faced failure, rebuilt habits, and left with confidence in a maneuver that felt at last like a weapon equal to the threat. Yet chalk encounters could only demonstrate so far. Convoy still faced nightly danger, and every run across the Atlantic carried the same mortal stakes. In Liverpool, the escorts had learned to defeat submarines on the mat. What remained unknown was whether those lessons would hold when black water closed around hulls and the horizon lit with fire. The answer would not wait long. The real test lay ahead, at sea, with a convoy numbered SC-104. Convoy SC-104, the first test. Convoy SC-104 crossed the North Atlantic under some of the worst conditions its escorts had yet faced. Nearly 50 merchant ships, burdened with food, oil and steel for Britain, stretched into the storm with only a half-dozen escorts holding guard. Heavy seas battered the hulls, freezing spray smothered decks, and watch crews struggled against exhaustion. Normally, such weather might have shielded the formation, but this night nature betrayed them. Curtains of auroral light bent across the horizon, washing the convoy in a pale glow that made every ship stand out. To those on watch, it was not spectacle but exposure. They were a beacon against the black Atlantic, and every man knew U-boats could see them from miles away. The attackers had already found them. Wolfpacks trailing for days had struck at the convoy's outer edges, picking off stragglers with ruthless efficiency. Explosions flashed across the sea, and debates spread through the crews in whispers. If torpedoes could find them even inside the formation, what hope remained? Britain's needs demanded the convoy press on regardless, but morale sagged. Men pictured unseen predators weaving among them, hungry for another chance to fire. In the middle of that night, Commander Ralph Hithot faced a decision few had rehearsed. Doctrine insisted that escorts stay tight and drive outward against any bearing, sweeping the periphery for attackers thought to circle from beyond. But recent reports from Liverpool's Western Approaches Tactical Unit suggested those assumptions were wrong. The alternative, Operation Raspberry, looked reckless on paper. It required escorts to pull away from their precious charges, opening gaps some captains believed suicidal, and fan out into triangular arcs behind the convoy. The promise was that submarines, following their most successful pattern of attack, would be caught surfacing astern or forced to stay deep as the trap tightened. The logic came from games run by Wrens with chalk encounters, not proven battle practice. Yet with merchantmen already lost, Hithot knew repeating standard doctrine meant little but more wreckage in the storm. He gave the order, commence Raspberry. To merchant skippers, the sudden change was alarming. The escort destroyers swung away and streamed toward the convoy's wake, their silhouettes disappearing into rain and spray. It seemed, for a moment, as if the convoy had been abandoned, but from the escorts came the thunder of star shells firing into the sky, casing the ocean in harsh halos of light that cut through the auroral glow. Below deck, sonar operators bent over their headsets, searching the depths astern with the practiced patience drilled into them at Liverpool. The noise was punishing, wind across the surface, the constant pulse of screws, the distant crash of waves. In that cacophony, a single echo could make the difference between safety and loss. Seconds scraped into minutes, and silence weighted every man. Some thought they had been sent on a fool's errand, stretching thin while submarines closed from the flanks. Then one operator stiffened. Faint, uncertain, but there. It was not random surf or metal debris. The rhythm repeated, steady and deliberate, a sound no storm could fake. He called contact. Another set confirmed. Bearings aligned. A submarine lay inside the sweep, just where WATU's boards predicted it would be. Hithot gave the order. Engines adjusted, depth charges primed, crews at stations braced against the spray. A run was made across the suspected position, charges rolled free into the black water, and moments later detonated with muffled thunder that shook through decks as though the ocean itself had convulsed. Foam erupted aft, men thrown against bulkheads by the concussive roll. The convoy behind staggered but held course. More charges followed. Systematic patterns dropped to keep the prey pinned down. Reports later revealed what those men only sensed in the moment. The submarine had taken heavy damage, its patrol ruined. It limped away toward base, unable to continue the hunt. It was not a kill, and no wreckage confirmed its end, but withdrawing a boat from the fight was victory enough. The Conv carried on under the auroral sky, fewer losses than circumstance had promised. For the first time, Raspberry, tested against real steel and torpedoes, had bent the odds in the Allies' favor. Relief seeped across the escorts. After years absorbing blows, they had struck back with method rather than chance. Exhausted sailors shared thin smiles, not in celebration but in recognition. Something in the balance had shifted. Senior officers reading the after-action reports later saw the same point, stripped of emotion. A new tactic, devised in Liverpool by Wrens and skeptics, had forced an attacking submarine to retreat where accepted doctrine had failed. That was enough to push doubt aside. Raspberry was not a game. It had proven itself under the harshest test possible. Convoy SC-104 was not the end of the battle, nor the last convoy to lose ships to wolfpacks, but it marked a subtle turning point. For once, escorts had wrested initiative from the hunters, and the proof of this success, written into official signals, began to spread across the Atlantic theater. It was no longer argument, it was combat testimony. Outcomes like this provided exactly the evidence Admiralty needed to integrate Raspberry into wider doctrine, moving it from experiment to accepted practice. What followed would be tracked not only in stories of ships that escaped destruction, but in the ledgers of men studying results. Over time, these engagements left a trail of figures, losses, tonnage delivered, submarines forced away, that gave a clearer picture than any single night at sea could provide. Numbers rewritten by 2025 analysis. When wartime commanders recalled Raspberry's effect, their evidence often rested on memory, reports scribbled under pressure, anecdotes traded in wardrooms, or the recollections of exhausted survivors. These accounts conveyed the atmosphere of change, but lacked measurable clarity. Only in the past decade have researchers applied modern tools to the surviving records. Between 2018 and 2025, digitization of convoy archives allowed thousands of journeys to be compared and tested as if they were datasets in an economic study. Patterns that wartime officers could never have plotted in real time became sharply visible. For the first time, Raspberry's impact could be expressed not just in testimony, but in statistical terms. The most telling results appear in convoy survival itself. Before Raspberry, escort formations were consistently penetrated, and loss rates hovered at levels that threatened Britain's imports. Convoys suffered multiple sinkings in single assaults, and averages over weeks suggested the collapse of shipping was a looming possibility. Once Raspberry spread through the escort forces, the trend line did not fade gradually, it shifted decisively. Historical analysis shows that after 1943, convoy survival improved even as the enemy increased pressure. What had appeared a losing battle suddenly stabilized. The contrast is obvious when set against the graphs. The drift toward disaster arrested in the same month's Raspberry became routine practice. Crucially, this reversal did not happen because the German effort slackened. On the contrary, German records show submarine deployments expanded in both 1942 and 1943. Their wolfpacks roamed further into the Atlantic, and patrols launched in greater volume. Yet the outcomes of those patrols tell a different story. In 1942, loss figures show roughly one boat destroyed for every 9 sent to sea. By 1943, the proportion had changed dramatically, closer to 1 in 5 never returned. This meant that a German commander now sailed with the expectation that survival was far less certain. These failures were not caused by accidents of weather or luck, but by escorts equipped with tactics that put submarines where they could be detected and hunted. Escorts trained at Liverpool began to apply their sweeps with consistency, forcing infiltrating submarines to remain submerged until their batteries drained, or exposing them under the glare of star shells. These actions shifted the mathematics of the campaign. A hunt that once offered the attacker relative safety now ended with greater frequency in a crippled hull or a final sinking. The geometry first sketched across chalkboards began to manifest in casualty rates, and that statistical increase in submarine losses weakened the entire assault strategy the German Navy relied upon. The improvement in convoy survival is further underscored in tonnage statistics. Britain's imports, which had declined through 1942, began to rise from mid-1943 onward, despite more U-boats at sea. Essentials such as grain, oil, and munitions reached ports in higher volumes. The fact that deliveries increased while enemy pressure grew is the clearest indicator that convoy escorts had gained the upper hand. Each saved freighter preserved tens of thousands of tons of cargo, enough to maintain food reserves, industrial throughput, and the equipment needed for campaigns far from the Atlantic. The scale of this effect reached into strategy. With shipping more secure, Allied planners gained confidence to move beyond mere survival and begin amassing forces for renewed offensives. The buildup of troops and material required for the Italian campaign, and later Normandy, depended on convoys that could deliver consistently. The narrowing of risks at sea directly enabled operations on land. Without it, the transatlantic bridge of men and weapons would never have accumulated in such numbers. Raspberry's influence was therefore not limited to ocean survival. It underpinned the logistics of the wider war. Modern studies also highlight the link between tactical innovation and psychological endurance. Before data analysis, successful sinkings of U-boats were explained as chance encounters. Luck or storms seemed decisive. Once records were compiled chronologically, a new picture emerged. U-boat casualties rose in line with the maneuver's introduction, revealing that what once felt like random fortune was the result of systemic change. This recognition transformed probability. Escort crews who had grown used to frustration found themselves equipped with realistic methods of detection, and the knowledge that their odds had improved reshaped morale. It confirmed both to the men and to their commanders that survival was now closer within their grasp. Statistics show that the initiative remained contested. Convoys still lost ships, and skilled U-boat commanders adapted when they could. Raspberry altered the balance by narrowing surprise. Submarines no longer operated with near impunity. By rendering their infiltrations more dangerous, escorts shifted the odds and redefined the campaign as a contest of endurance the Allies could sustain. That shift in probability, though measured in percentages on charts, carried immediate human consequence in the confidence of crews and the willingness of governments to plan in longer horizons. It is for these reasons that modern analysts place Raspberry alongside the other celebrated breakthroughs of the Atlantic War. Radar extended vision, code-breaking stripped signals of secrecy, long-range aircraft closed the mid-ocean gap. Raspberry's contribution was different but comparable because it altered U-boat tactics at the level of daily engagement. Where technology expanded awareness, Raspberry restructured response. Together, these measures created a multi-layered system of defense, each working in tandem. Numbers from recent studies confirm that Raspberry's effect in reducing losses and increasing kill rates was not minor, but decisive enough to stand among these giants. One credibility anchor rests in the scope of WATU itself. From February 1942 to July 1945, the Western Approaches Tactical Unit ran weekly courses, ultimately training around 5,000 officers. This diffusion of knowledge meant Raspberry spread not as a niche experiment, but as a fleet-wide doctrine. Admiral Max Horton's acceptance of WATU's demonstrations secured the authority necessary for implementation. Without Horton's endorsement, no amount of statistical proof today would matter because the tactic might never have reached the sea lanes. The fact that it did, and that new analysis validates its effectiveness, closes the circle between invention, adoption, and measured outcome. By setting these findings against broader data, modern historians conclude that Raspberry reduced losses on a scale that shifted strategy across the Atlantic. It turned operations from a gamble into a sustainable system and weakened the German campaign at its core. More than that, The analysis illustrates what can happen when institutions risk unorthodox solutions. Evidence from 2025 supports what Roberts and his Wrens believed in 1942, that a handful of ideas tested on mats could hold consequences equal to any machine pulled from a laboratory or factory. These results also point forward. Raspberry proved that once adaptation was possible, it could be repeated. Wargaming enabled ideas to be tested quickly, refined, and pushed back into the fleet before the enemy adjusted. The data underscores a final lesson. The enduring victory lay not only in one tactic, but in demonstrating that innovation itself could be systematized. The work of 2025 therefore reminds us that Raspberry's greatest contribution may not be a set of sweeps and star shells, but the precedent it created. It showed that assumptions could be overturned, that doctrine was not fixed, and that survival in the Atlantic required continual rethinking. From that moment, convoy defense was no longer about holding to established patterns, but about treating tactical change as a permanent necessity. The path this opened did not stop with Raspberry, it began there. From Raspberry to a doctrine of innovation. Operation Raspberry marked only the beginning of WATU's work. Once the Liverpool team demonstrated that a convoy could defend itself by calculated sweeps, each new wrinkle in U-boat behavior became another problem to solve on the mats at Derby House. Games multiplied, the boards reset again and again, and the Wrens refined counters until makeshift drawings advanced into formal tactics. Out of those trials grew a catalogue of maneuvers with their own distinctive names. Half Raspberry adapted the original triangular sweep for convoys with fewer escorts. Pineapple was built for the chaos of multiple wolfpack boats striking at once. Banana covered solitary attacks. Beta Search targeted shadowing submarines waiting for their moment to close. And Step Aside provided the first counter to a new German weapon, the acoustic torpedo, or T5 NAT. Each maneuver was tested, discarded, or improved until its logic held against dozens of simulated runs. Nothing left that room by guesswork. In many ways, this evolution built naturally on the work of Johnny Walker's earlier Buttercup maneuver. Raspberry had begun as a correction to Buttercup, stripping away its assumption that submarines always attacked from outside the convoy. Now, the fruit-named cousins carried the inheritance forward. Together, they formed a coherent series of experiments, each arising from the reality of convoy defense under pressure. The shift this represented went beyond the details of each maneuver. Before WATU's work in 1942 and 1943, doctrine had rested on tradition. Officers were expected to replicate fixed patterns and hold formations rigidly, trusting that discipline itself would overcome the enemy. With WATU, that picture inverted. Convoy commanders were no longer judged by rote adherence, but by their willingness to accept new drills when presented with convincing evidence. It meant that earlier tactics were treated not as scripture, but as provisional. Once circumstances changed, yesterday's solution could and should be discarded. For the first time, adaptability became a defining responsibility. The new commander-in-chief of Western approaches, Admiral Max Horton, personified the change. Horton was a celebrated submariner from the First World War and an officer steeped in established naval thinking. His first encounters with WATU carried the skepticism common among senior commanders, that games run by Roberts, Wrens, and convalescent officers were amateur distractions beside the grind of real convoy duty. But Horton accepted an invitation to test the method himself. Guided onto the boards by Wrens, he played out a scenario as a U-boat commander and quickly found his moves anticipated and punished. A 20-year-old Wren outmaneuvered him completely. For Horton, the display was stark. What skepticism could dismiss on paper worked unmistakably in practice. Far from covering his embarrassment, he used the episode to endorse WATU and draw it closer to fleet strategy. With his backing, the gap between experimental game and operational order closed. This endorsement carried consequences for how officers measured themselves. A commander's standing was no longer tied only to how well he enforced drill or punished slackness. Increasingly, authority attached to his ability to think like the enemy. On the boards, that skill determined whether he lost merchants within minutes or preserved them. The lessons were sharp enough to erode pride. Distinguished captains often found themselves outfought by Wrens wielding chalk and logic. The humiliation was deliberate because it taught them to shed assumptions before rejoining the convoy lanes. Officers who could not adapt gave way to others who could. WATU's teaching extended far beyond Liverpool. Its week-long courses ran without interruption from 1942 onward, graduating around 5,000 officers by war's end. Those officers did not come only from Britain. Canadians, Americans, Free French, Norwegians, and others cycled through the program, each exposed to the same boards, the same markers, and the same expectation that survival meant continuous adaptation. By 1943, training schools in Halifax, Londonderry, and elsewhere replicated the model. The effect was standardization. Multinational escort groups could meet for the first time and already share a tactical vocabulary. Simple signals now carried shared meaning because their training tracks had crossed at Liverpool. The United States Navy's eventual adoption of British convoy practice magnified this exchange. In 1942, sinkings along its coastline had forced a reluctant abandonment of solo sailings. Once convoy escorts were in place, WATU's catalogue of responses traveled across the Atlantic with them. What had begun as improvisations in a chalk-dusted room became shared practice for navies facing the same wolfpacks on distant coasts. Each maneuver reflected a direct reply to German innovation. Pineapple forced a second or third U-boat to dive before attacking, keeping wolfpacks from unleashing their salvos in unison. Banana built in protective zigzag sonar sweeps tailored against lone attackers. Beta Search anticipated the movements of shadowing boats after they submerged, guiding escorts into systematic patterns that denied them the chance to lurk untouched. Step Aside directly confronted the new T-5 Nat acoustic torpedo, commanding escorts to alter speed and course sharply so that the homing devices exhausted themselves without a strike. In each, the principle repeated. Every fresh danger demanded a fresh counter. The cycle had become institutional. The practical effect of this culture was clear. Officers returned to see expecting innovation as routine. They trained their crews not to cling to an unchanging script, but to treat new orders as inevitable responses to the enemy's next move. For many, this was their first introduction to war as a contest of adaptation rather than endurance. It shifted how convoys were defended. Escorts fought not as reactive guardians, but as predators seeking angles against their unseen opponents. The Wrens tabletop games had fostered a serious recognition that thinking like a U-boat mattered as much as spotting one. Trimmed of rhetoric, the lesson was plain. Doctrine itself had changed. Instead of a single formula defending convoys for the duration of the war, commanders now worked within a system that assumed its own evolution. Manuals could be rewritten each season, and fresh graduates could expect that the drills they had just learned might be replaced within months. WATU had established the precedent. Tactics must be temporary, doctrine must be alive, and the officer corps must think with the same flexibility as its enemy. From that shift came measurable consequences. Allied escort captains who embraced these methods no longer entered the ocean lanes with only hope. They sailed equipped with the most current set of answers to U-boat tactics, and their survival rates reflected that difference. Defense had been transformed from static ordeal into continuous contest, supported by a doctrine of invention. That doctrinal shift meant convoys no longer sailed on hope. They sailed with new thinking that produced measurable survival gains. And soon, those gains would be put to their greatest test, in the widest waters where wolfpacks gathered far from all land. The battle of mid-ocean and the statistics of survival. The most decisive fighting in the Atlantic came not near the coasts, but in the deep mid-ocean, days from any landfall or rescue. By 1942, German command identified a vast region sailors called the Air Gap, where Allied patrol planes from Newfoundland and Britain could not reach. Across nearly 1,000 miles, the horizon held no possibility of air cover. For Admiral Dönitz, this gap became the natural battlefield. If wolfpacks massed in its center, convoys would be forced to pass through with only escorts between them and destruction. The geography favored him. Along coastal routes, aircraft had forced U-boats to submerge during daylight hours, breaking their ability to stalk convoys freely. In the air gap, no such threat existed. Surfaced boats could charge ahead, regroup, and launch in coordination under cover of night. Radio reports from scouting boats positioned entire packs across the convoy's expected track. If even a fraction of the submarines inside the formation struck, the resulting confusion made counterattack difficult. By the opening months of 1943, this grim logic had concentrated most of the battle in the Central Ocean routes. Conditions that spring grew harsher still. Convoy escorts recorded being shadowed for days, with attacks mounting each night as one submarine pursued and another replaced it. German staff sought not scattered raids, but decisive impact. Packs of 20 or more boats attacked simultaneously, creating layers of contact that escorts had no choice but to divide against. For those sailing inside the gap, it felt less like a transit and more like a sustained assault, with torpedoes arriving in waves from multiple directions. May 1943 marked the peak of this strategy. Convoys meeting wolfpacks in mid-Atlantic faced weeks of attrition on a scale no commander had yet endured. German records confirm that wolfpacks at this time were concentrated in greater numbers than ever before, in pursuit of a turning point. The location, beyond aerial reach, appeared ideal, and reports to Berlin expected that Allied shipping losses would climb to crisis levels. Yet the conditions of the ocean were not only an opportunity for the attackers. Into this theater came new methods created in Liverpool. Operation Raspberry, first designed for single penetrations, carried principles that easily scaled to these massed encounters. Escorts fanned into triangular sweeps behind convoys, keeping coherence or probing precisely where U-boats attempted to shadow. Submarines that sought to close in from astern were caught by overlapping beams. The discipline of sweeping as a unit denied wolfpacks, their preferred tactic of exploiting gaps when escorts scattered. Raspberry worked because its geometry reduced the chaos commanders normally faced. Instead of chasing each contact as a separate incident, crews operated a routine tested repeatedly on boards. When a bearing emerged, star shells marked the sky in cycles proven to hinder a submariner's escape. Depth charges fell to time intervals selected in Liverpool, narrowing the corridors left for survival. Officers under strain did not rely only on instinct. They enacted the sequences drilled into them, decisions compressed into reactions rehearsed dozens of times before. These defensive changes combined with new technology to bend the balance of the fight. High-frequency direction finding, HFDF or HUF-DUF, intercepted radio bursts whenever U-boats coordinated their positions. Convoys that once wandered blind now sailed with bearings already suggesting where packs waited. When the contacts matured into attack, Raspberry sweeps pinned those boats. Meanwhile, gradual extension of long-range aircraft tightened the air gap itself. Even sporadic patrols meant wolfpacks lost their freedom to cruise surfaced in daylight. The causal chain was clear. HFDF and code insights gave convoys approximate locations of packs. Long-range aircraft limited the submarine's use of diesel power in open daylight. Raspberries netted triangles forced exposure once they closed. Each measure reinforced the others, creating an environment in which hunting groups became at risk before they ever fired. The results showed most dramatically in that May. Submarine losses climbed to levels no commander had seen. Historical records count 41 U-boats destroyed in that month alone, a figure that dwarfed every earlier tally. Dozens more limped back from patrol incapacitated by damage. Instead of breaking convoy supply lines, Germany had suffered catastrophic attrition among its crews. What Berlin had intended as a decisive push marked instead the reversal of the campaign. For Dönitz, even determined optimism could not disguise the numbers. Each replacement boat took months to build. Trained crews proved harder still to replace. Charts that once portrayed rising tonnage of Allied shipping Loss now showed disproportionate sacrifice of U-boats without equivalent result. Soon after May, he ordered a reduction of Atlantic operations, a tacit admission that the balance had swung irreversibly. The strategic consequence was immense. Convoys still carried risk, but Britain's supply routes no longer balanced on collapse. Ships that set out across the mid-ocean now had a statistical chance of arrival far higher than in the years before. Loss rates shrank while import tonnage rose, even as the number of U-boats deployed remained high. The core aim of Germany's campaign, starving Britain into isolation, was gone. To those on deck, the meaning came less from figures than from survival itself. Crews noted that torpedo tracks seemed fewer, sonar contacts ended in more decisive strikes, and wolfpack attacks broke apart faster. Arrivals in British ports carried more freighters intact, more cargoes delivered, and fewer survivor boats limping behind. Families at home felt the same impact in the restoration of steadier supplies of food and fuel. Production lines, once interrupted by shortages, steadied as cargoes landed more reliably. For senior command, the transformation was measured in statistics. From January to the summer of 1943, the proportion of convoys completed without loss rose steadily. By contrast, submarine mortality grew, shifting from about 1 in 9 lost per patrol in 1942 to nearly 1 in 5 in 1943. These contrasting trajectories told the whole story. Escorts were now winning. The mid-ocean campaign exposed a wider lesson. Raspberry had not been a trick confined to single convoy skirmishes. Its ability to adapt to changing threat levels, to scale from lone attacks to mass raids, made it part of a living system. Together with HF-DF and aircraft, it formed the architecture of Allied survival. The same principles that played out on chalkboards sustained coherence amid the largest naval clash of the war. By the end of that spring, the Atlantic had shifted from dangerous gamble to calculated crossing. Hedgehog mortars, radar upgrades, and more escort carriers would follow, but the turning point already lay behind. What the records identify as a month of slaughter for German submarines was in practice a moment when the system built at Liverpool proved itself on the most exposed stage. The statistics of survival carried weight precisely because they were not abstractions. They were the difference between Britain starved or supplied, between Allied armies in place or stranded, between submariners emboldened or retreating. Numbers alone made those truths plain, inscribing in convoy figures the outcome of decisions taken first on linoleum floors. May 1943 did not end the war at sea, but it ended the U-boat's grip on Atlantic lifelines. Yet even as numbers confirmed victory, the intellectual origins of these tactics were less clearly acknowledged. The devices of wargaming, the Wrens, ingenuity, and the very name Raspberry risked slipping from the story. What survived in data and outcomes did not always survive in memory. And in the years after the fighting, that forgetting would become its own legacy. The forgotten legacy. In the decades that followed the Atlantic battle, the role of WATU and Operation Raspberry remained muted in most histories. While wartime officers and participants recognized the tactic's influence, published accounts of the Battle of the Atlantic emphasized radar, code-breaking, or American industrial production. These stories fit comfortably into Cold War narratives that highlighted technology and manufacturing strength. By comparison, the image of Wrens moving wooden blocks across a floor in Liverpool appeared less monumental, more like a curiosity than a deciding factor in maritime survival. Thus, in many general accounts from the 1950s through the 1970s, Raspberry and the work of WATU were underemphasized, often reduced to a passing note if mentioned at all. This neglect was not only about the preference for machines and industry. Gender bias played a decisive role in shaping who was remembered and how. The daily work at WATU was carried out largely by Wrens, women in their late teens and early 20s, supported by a few convalescent officers and civilians. Yet in official documents, they often appeared under clerical classifications, their analytical labor described as assistance rather than authorship. Their tasks, plotting sighting reports, testing strategies repeatedly, spotting contradictions in doctrine, resembled the functions of trained analysts, but official language shrank this into support duties. Captain Gilbert Roberts, the senior officer who guided the unit, was visible to the Admiralty and later decorated with a CBE. Wrens, like Jean Laidlaw, who developed core aspects of the Raspberry tactic, received only routine discharge papers. This imbalance reinforced stereotypes that defined women as helpers rather than principal contributors, leaving public histories with the impression that tactics had been derived solely from the minds of senior male officers. The Cold War's attraction to technological explanations intensified the problem. Public accounts celebrated long-range radar as the eye that pierced fog, Enigma decrypts as the secret key to enemy movement, and American shipyards as the arsenal that ensured supply. These narratives provided neat stories of industrial superiority, aligning with the era's fascination with electronics and production. Raspberry did not fit that framework. It was not a machine, but an idea tested through repeated games. Admiralties eager to highlight their technological advances rarely paused to emphasize rooms where Wrens mapped U-boat movements with chalk. As a result, even though Raspberry decisively shaped survival rates in 1943, it seldom appeared in official atlases or widely read summaries of the war at sea. The picture began to shift only after the turn of the millennium. The digitization of naval logs and the declassification of operational reports shed new light on the details of convoy tactics. Researchers could now track survival curves across hundreds of crossings and see the clear inflection where Raspberry and related tactics were adopted. Notes from WATU courses, once buried in archives, revealed the scale of training. Thousands of officers rotated through Liverpool and were instructed in the same triangular sweeps. These discoveries made it harder to sustain the older view that tactics had changed by instinct alone. Clear documentary evidence linked specific doctrinal alterations to measurable improvements. By the 2010s, a new generation of historians began restoring WATU to the narrative. Simon Parkin's 2019 book, *A Game of Birds and Wolves*, centered the Wrens rather than sidelining them, showing how figures like Jean Laidlaw and Janet Okel tested, refined, and taught the maneuvers used at sea. Other works highlighted how Raspberry complemented radar and Enigma rather than standing apart from them. Statistical re-evaluation of convoy battles showed that U-boat casualty rates began to exceed their successes only after WATU's methods were put in general use. The Institute of Chartered Accountants published pieces in 2025, drawing attention to Laidlaw's background in accountancy and her overlooked wartime contribution. Together, this scholarship marked a correction. The Wrens no longer appeared only in passing references, but in accounts that recognized their influence as pivotal. This change in historiography also altered how professionals in the armed services looked back on WATU. Roberts and the Wrens had engaged in what today would be called red teaming, imagining U-boat moves from the opposite point of view, running through variations until the weaknesses of official assumptions became clear. In the 1940s, the method appeared eccentric to many senior officers. Today, it is integral to military education. Naval colleges now use Raspberry as an early case study in structured wargaming and innovation. Students are shown that victory came not simply from steel tonnage or electronic devices, but from the willingness of a small unit to question doctrine and test new solutions in simulation. This message, emphasized in training today, elevates the significance of WATU beyond the technical details of any single maneuver. For officers entering service, Raspberry is presented as evidence that institutions can innovate under severe pressure if given space to experiment. The very act of drilling thousands of escort captains in week-long courses at Liverpool is treated as a model of how to institutionalize adaptability. Case studies highlight the way Wrens, persistence, resetting counters, and running through games until fatigue blurred, prepared commanders to abandon ingrained habits at sea. These teaching examples remind students that military culture changes when experimentation is made routine and when ideas are tested systematically before lives depend on them. The level of personal memory, however, recognition arrived much later. Many Wrens returned to civilian life unacknowledged, their wartime service fading into obscurity even within their own families. Laidlaw resumed work as an accountant. Her decades after the war bore little public trace of the pivotal role she had played in overcoming the U-boat threat. For a long time, the weight of decorations, memoirs, and official histories left her, and her colleagues absent from the public imagination. Only after new publications and documentaries appeared were their names widely restored to the story. Even then, the contrast remained striking. Men who had attended courses sometimes received medals, while those who built the courses did not. Today, that imbalance is gradually corrected. Museums, academic departments, and naval institutions cite WATU's contribution as central to victory in the Atlantic. Public exhibitions now include the chalked tactical mats and the photographs of Wrens analyzing reports by lamplight. Historians no longer ask whether Raspberry mattered, but examine how quickly its adoption shifted probabilities at sea. That focus has helped ensure the Wrens' intellectual labor is recognized as part of strategic history rather than relegated to the margins of clerical service. This rehabilitation underscores the lesson that victories are not only products of ships and devices, but of individuals willing to rethink assumptions. To omit WATU from the record is to distort how the Atlantic battle was truly won. Restoring their story restores an understanding of the cultural conditions that allowed change to occur, diversity of perspective, permission to question standing orders, and the discipline to test ideas methodically before risking them in combat. Jean Laidlaw's journey illustrates the point with clarity. She entered WATU in 1942 as a young woman trained in accountancy, applied those skills to plotting statistics and inventing tactics, and left the service unrecognized. Decades later, she re-emerged in archives and publications as one of the central figures whose work shaped Convoy survival. A lifetime spent outside the public eye closed with belated acknowledgement from historians and public media. Her story, and the stories of other Wrens like her, remind us that the human contributions behind tactical innovation deserve equal place in the record. Recognition of WATU and Raspberry today is therefore more than a footnote restored. It is an ongoing correction of how history values ideas and who is credited for them. The work that once seemed too improvised to credit now stands as an example cited in classrooms and military academies. In this sense, the forgotten legacy has become a recovered one, holding lessons not just about tactics, but about the culture of innovation itself. That recovery leads naturally to a wider reflection on how navies, and perhaps organizations in general, must change if they wish to survive the next crisis. Operation Raspberry was more than a single tactic. It marked a cultural turn. It proved that naval defense could no longer rely on inherited doctrine alone. After its adoption, convoy survival improved markedly, with trained escorts applying methods that materially strengthened Britain's supply lifeline. WATU had shown that a small team, given freedom to test assumptions, could alter outcomes once thought fixed. Raspberry was one decisive contributor among several, alongside radar, air cover, code breaking, and industrial output, that together reshaped the Battle of the Atlantic. A handful of Wrens and officers had turned imagination into doctrine. How many other overlooked innovators across history have done the same? If you'd like a deeper dive into the Horton versus Oakle wargame or Raspberry in action at sea, tell us in the comments.